The suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek was as peaceful as they came. Rows of tidy houses with neatly trimmed lawns lined the streets, each one adorned with cheerful mailboxes and flowerbeds. The residents prided themselves on their close-knit community, which was why the formation of the neighborhood watch group felt more like a social club than a necessity. But everything changed when the jogger appeared. It started innocuously enough. A man in a faded gray hoodie and running shorts began passing through the neighborhood every morning at exactly 6 a.m. He wasn't someone anyone recognized, but that wasn't unusual. Joggers from nearby neighborhoods often used Willow Creek's quiet streets for exercise. What struck people as odd was his routine. He always slowed down when passing the Wilkes house and glanced at their windows before continuing, every day without fail. At first, the residents brushed it off. Maybe he liked their landscaping, or maybe he had friends nearby. But Linda Myers, the neighborhood watch's self-appointed captain, couldn't shake her unease. "It's not normal," she told the group at their monthly meeting, a gathering of concerned residents sipping coffee in the Wilkes backyard. "He doesn't just jog past. He hesitates. It's like he's looking for something." "Or someone," added Paul, a retired schoolteacher who had a habit of looking for the worst in people. The Wilkes family, whose house seemed to be the jogger's focal point, didn't see the issue. "We've never had problems," said Carol Wilkes, shrugging. "It's probably nothing." But Linda's instincts told her otherwise. That night, she sat by her living room window, watching the darkened street. The jogger's morning runs didn't bother her as much as the thought of what he might be doing after dark. At 11:47 p.m., she saw him. A shadow moved swiftly through the Wilkes backyard, the faint crunch of gravel underfoot barely audible. Linda's heart raced as she grabbed her phone and peered through the curtains. The jogger, it was unmistakably him, was crouched near the back fence, looking up at the Wilkes' attic window. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, before slipping into the shadows. The next morning, Linda called an emergency meeting of the neighborhood watch. "I saw him last night, near the Wilkes house," she said, her voice trembling. "He wasn't jogging, he was watching." Paul nodded gravely. "We need to find out who he is and what he's doing here." The group devised a plan to observe the jogger more closely. Linda volunteered to document his routine while Paul offered to comb through local records to identify him. Carol Wilkes, still unconvinced there was any real threat, reluctantly agreed to let the group use her backyard as a stakeout spot. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the neighborhood watch members took their positions. Linda hid behind a hedge with a pair of binoculars, her heart pounding in anticipation. The minutes crawled by, but the jogger didn't appear. Just as the group was beginning to doubt Linda's sighting, a faint rustle broke the silence. The jogger emerged from the darkness, moving with a deliberate, almost predatory grace. He carried no flashlight, yet he seemed to navigate the backyard effortlessly. As he approached the Wilkes house, Linda caught a glimpse of his face, pale, gaunt, and expressionless. He reached into his pocket, pulling out something small and shiny. "He's doing something to the window," Linda whispered into her walkie-talkie. Before anyone could react, the jogger froze, his head snapping toward the hedge where Linda was hiding. Their eyes met for a split second, and then he bolted into the night. The group was shaken. They had no idea what the jogger's intentions were, but one thing was clear: he wasn't just passing through. As the neighborhood watch regrouped to plan their next move, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. As the neighborhood watch regrouped to strategize, strange reports began trickling in from various neighbors. It started with small complaints: blankets disappearing from porches, cans of food missing from unlocked garages, and even a flashlight gone from someone's backyard. These incidents seemed trivial, almost laughable, until Linda connected the dots. "What if it's him?" she asked during their impromptu meeting at Paul's house. "He's not just watching, he's taking." Paul scratched his chin, skeptical but intrigued. If he's been stealing, we'd need proof, and it's not like anyone saw him doing it. Yet, Linda emphasized, we're seeing a pattern. Look, the Wilkes already have him lurking around their house. Now, random items are disappearing, and they're all things someone might need if they're camping out. Carol Wilkes, sitting with her arms crossed, sighed. I'll admit, hearing things in our attic at night has been unsettling, but we checked it out. There's nothing up there except some old boxes and insulation. But did you check thoroughly? Linda pressed. If he's smart enough to evade us this long, he's smart enough to find a way to hide. Paul leaned forward, his voice lowering. What if we're being paranoid? We have no hard evidence yet. Let's not jump to conclusions. Still, the group decided to take further precautions. Linda suggested everyone double-check their homes and lock everything, while Paul took the lead in combing through the Wilkes' property one more time. That night, the eerie atmosphere in Willow Creek grew thicker. People were on edge, locking their doors and peering out their windows at the faintest noise. Meanwhile, Linda took it upon herself to walk through her backyard, flashlight in hand. She scanned every corner, heart racing with every creak of the night. Halfway through her patrol, she noticed a faint glint in the grass near her fence. Bending down, she picked up what looked like a can opener. It wasn't hers. The next morning, as Linda shared her find, Paul came with news of his own. I think there's something weird going on in the Wilkes attic. I didn't see anything outright, but it feels off. There's a corner where the insulation's been moved, like someone's been crawling through. The scream jolted everyone into motion. Linda, Paul, and Carol raced to the Wilkes home, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. Carol's teenage daughter, Emily, stood trembling at the bottom of the attic stairs, her face pale as a ghost. I saw someone, she stammered, pointing a shaky finger upward. There's someone up there. Paul grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen counter and exchanged a tense look with Linda. Stay down here, he instructed Carol and Emily. We'll check it out. The attic ladder creaked ominously as Paul climbed, the flashlight beam cutting through the thick shadows. Linda followed closely, her breath shallow. The air grew colder as they ascended, the faint smell of dust and insulation filling their noses. At first glance, the attic seemed empty. Boxes were stacked neatly along the walls, and insulation covered most of the floor. But then Linda noticed something out of place. A small pile of wrappers and empty cans tucked behind a stack of boxes. Paul, she whispered, pointing toward the makeshift stash. Paul swung the flashlight beam over the pile and froze. Someone's been living up here. Before Linda could respond, a sudden noise came from the far corner of the attic, a rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. Paul directed the flashlight toward the sound, and both of them gasped. A pair of eyes reflected the light, wide and unblinking, staring back at them from the darkness. Who's there? Paul demanded, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it bolted, scrambling toward a small opening in the far wall. Linda caught a glimpse of a gaunt face and disheveled hair before the figure disappeared through the hole. He's getting away! Linda shouted, but the opening was too small for either of them to follow. Paul crouched down to inspect it, realizing it led to a crawl space between the walls. He must have been using this to move around, Paul said grimly. We need to call the police. As they descended the ladder to inform Carol and Emily, Linda's mind raced. Who was this person? Why had he been living in the Wilkes attic? And how long had he been there? The discovery raised more questions than answers, and the tension in the room was palpable as they waited for the authorities to arrive. The police arrived quickly, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the Wilkes house. Linda explained the situation to the officers, while Paul led them to the attic. The crawlspace opening caught their attention, but it was too narrow for anyone to follow without specialized equipment. One officer discovered something wedged behind the boxes near the makeshift stash, a battered leather-bound journal. Its edges were worn, and the cover was scratched, as if it had been carried around for years. "This might tell us something," the officer said, handing it to Linda. Back downstairs, the neighborhood watch gathered around as Linda flipped through the journal's pages. Most of the entries were written in a messy scrawl, with scattered sketches of the neighborhood. Maps of the streets and markings on specific houses, including the Wilkes, stood out. "This guy's been watching us for weeks," Paul said, his voice filled with dread. Linda pointed to a chilling entry. "The attic is the perfect spot. They never hear me. They'll never know I'm here." The group exchanged uneasy glances. The journal hinted at something deeper than just a squatter looking for shelter. It chronicled the joggers' observations, detailing the comings and goings of multiple families, listing times, names, and even routines. As they reached the last few pages, Linda noticed a sketch of an unfamiliar face. A man with hollow eyes and sharp cheekbones. Beneath it, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were the words, "He's looking for me." The loud crash reverberated through the Wilkes house, jolting everyone into motion. Linda, Paul, and the officers rushed to the backyard, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Carol and Emily stood frozen in the living room, clutching each other as the noise echoed in their ears. Linda's heart pounded as she approached the scene. The trash cans near the fence had been overturned, their contents scattered across the lawn. A large branch from a nearby tree lay on the ground, its leaves still rustling. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a freak accident caused by the wind, until they noticed the broken latch on the backyard gate, swinging open ominously. "He was here," Paul muttered, shining his flashlight toward the shadows beyond the fence. The beam caught something glinting in the dirt, another clue left behind. Linda bent down to pick it up, holding up a torn scrap of fabric, muddy and frayed. "Could he have gone into the woods?" one of the officers asked, gesturing toward the dense tree line that bordered the neighborhood. The officers spread out, their radios crackling as they coordinated a search of the immediate area. Meanwhile, Linda's instincts told her there was more to find. She scanned the backyard carefully, her flashlight lingering on the ground until it caught something unusual. A faint trail of footprints leading toward the Wilkes' shed. She motioned for Paul to follow her. The shed door creaked open as Linda pushed it cautiously. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of soil and decay. Gardening tools hung neatly on the walls, but in the corner, something was out of place. A makeshift bed made of old blankets and a pillow stuffed with leaves. A half-empty water bottle and a granola bar wrapper lay beside it. Paul examined the scene, his expression grim. "He's been using this as a secondary hideout." Linda's stomach turned. How long has he been watching us like this? Living right under our noses? Suddenly, they heard a rustling sound behind the shed. Both turned quickly, their flashlights illuminating the area just in time to catch a fleeting glimpse of the jogger's silhouette darting into the trees. His movements were quick, almost animalistic, and within seconds he disappeared into the shadows. "He's still close!" Linda exclaimed, adrenaline surging through her. She fumbled for her walkie-talkie to alert the officers, but Paul grabbed her arm. "We can't chase him in there," he said. "It's too dangerous." The woods loomed large, dark, and uninviting as the searchlights from the officers combed through the trees. The faint rustling of leaves, accompanied by the occasional crack of a twig, seemed to amplify the tension. Linda stood at the edge of the forest, her flashlight shaking slightly in her grip. Paul, standing beside her, was torn between caution and resolve. "We need to wait for backup," he said, his voice low but firm. Linda shook her head. "If we wait, he could slip away completely. He's been hiding in plain sight for weeks. Who knows what else he's planning?" One of the officers approached, radio crackling. "We've found a trail, tracks leading deeper into the forest. They're fresh." Linda took a deep breath and stepped forward, determination outweighing her fear. Paul reluctantly followed, muttering under his breath about the recklessness of chasing a man who clearly knew the terrain better than any of them. The group moved cautiously, flashlights sweeping across the underbrush. The trail was faint but visible. Crushed leaves, broken branches, and occasional scuffs in the dirt that betrayed the jogger's path. Every few steps, Linda's heart raced as she imagined catching a glimpse of the gaunt figure darting between the trees. As they moved deeper, the air grew colder, and the woods seemed to close in around them. Paul stopped abruptly, shining his flashlight onto a cluster of branches hanging low to the ground. Tied to one of them was a small, frayed piece of fabric, matching the torn scrap they'd found in the Wilkes yard. "He's leaving a trail," Linda murmured. "Or leading us somewhere," Paul replied grimly. The realization sent a shiver down Linda's spine, but she pressed on. They reached a small clearing where the footprints seemed to scatter. In the center of the clearing was an abandoned campsite, a fire pit with ash still warm, a small tarp stretched over a branch, and more wrappers littering the ground. "He's close," one of the officers said, scanning the perimeter with his flashlight. Suddenly, a sharp whistle pierced the air, freezing everyone in their tracks. Linda turned toward the source of the sound but saw nothing. The woods had fallen eerily silent. "What was that?" Paul whispered. Before anyone could answer, a crashing sound came from the opposite side of the clearing. Flashlights swung wildly toward the noise, but there was no sign of movement, just the echo of something tearing through the brush. "It's a distraction," Linda said, her voice tight. "He's trying to keep us off his trail." The group split into pairs, each taking a different direction from the clearing. Linda and Paul stuck together, their flashlights bobbing in unison as they moved cautiously through the undergrowth. The sense of being watched grew heavier with each step. Then, Linda's flashlight caught something unusual ahead, a figure crouched low against a tree. She motioned for Paul to stop and crept closer, her breath catching in her throat. "Freeze!" Paul called out, his voice shattering the silence. The figure bolted, disappearing into the shadows once more. As Linda and Paul gave chase, the chapter ends with Linda stumbling over something on the ground, a small notebook dropped in the jogger's haste. She picked it up, her hands trembling as she realized it might hold the answers they desperately needed. Linda flipped through the small notebook as she and Paul regrouped in the clearing. The pages were worn and filled with jagged handwriting, much like the journal they'd found in the attic. But this notebook wasn't just notes and sketches. It was filled with cryptic phrases, strange symbols, and what looked like coordinates. "This isn't just random rambling," Linda muttered, scanning the pages. "It's like he's tracking something or someone." Paul leaned over her shoulder, pointing to a line that sent a chill down their spines. "They're getting too close. I'll have to move tonight." "That confirms it," Paul said. "He knew we'd find his hideouts. He's been watching us as closely as we've been watching him." One of the officers radioed in, breaking the tense moment. "We've found something. A new trail leading northeast. It's heading toward the creek." Paul nodded toward the direction of the call. "Let's go." The group pushed forward, following the officer's lead as they navigated the increasingly dense woods. The sound of rushing water grew louder with each step, and soon they found themselves standing at the edge of the creek. The moonlight glinted off the surface, casting eerie reflections against the rocks and trees. "It's too quiet," Linda whispered, scanning the area with her flashlight. She felt the weight of the notebook in her pocket, its cryptic words and symbols haunting her thoughts. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted something unusual. A small wooden structure partially hidden among the trees on the other side of the creek. It looked like an old hunting blind, but it had been reinforced with newer materials. Tarps and ropes hung haphazardly around it, and a faint light glowed from inside. "Over there," she whispered, motioning to the others. The officers waded across the shallow creek first, their movements careful and deliberate. Linda and Paul followed close behind, the cold water seeping through their shoes and sending chills up their legs. As they approached the structure, the faint glow grew brighter, and they could hear the muffled sound of movement inside. One of the officers gestured for silence, raising his hand as he approached the entrance. Linda held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The officer pushed open the makeshift door, and the glow of a small lantern illuminated the space inside. The structure was empty. It was clearly lived in, though. Blankets were piled in one corner, alongside a backpack stuffed with clothing and supplies. A small propane lantern sat on a makeshift table, its light flickering against the walls. Scattered across the floor were papers and more notebooks, all covered in the same cryptic handwriting. "He's been here recently," one of the officers said, examining the scene. "This place isn't abandoned." Paul picked up one of the notebooks and flipped through it. "This is organized. It's like he's planning something." Linda's flashlight caught something on the wall, a map pinned to the wooden planks. It showed the entire neighborhood, with several houses circled in red, including the Wilkes home. Beneath the map was a single chilling phrase scrawled in bold letters: "They don't see it coming." The chilling words on the map fueled an urgency Linda had never felt before. She snapped a picture with her phone, her fingers trembling. Paul continued flipping through the notebooks, muttering under his breath as he scanned the symbols and phrases. "This isn't just surveillance," he said, pointing to a page with coordinates matching locations on the map. "This is strategic." One of the officers interrupted. "We've radioed for reinforcements, but it'll take some time for them to reach this deep into the woods. We should move cautiously." Linda's focus shifted back to the hunting blind. The space seemed ordinary at first glance, but something about the floorboards didn't sit right with her. She crouched down, knocking gently against the wood until she heard a hollow sound. "There's something under here," she whispered. Paul helped her pry up the loose boards, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a metal lockbox, its surface scratched and dented. Linda hesitated before opening it, her heart racing as she turned the latch. The lid creaked, revealing its contents: old photographs, letters, and what appeared to be a collection of IDs. Paul picked up one of the photos, a grainy, black and white image of a man standing in front of a house that looked eerily familiar. "That's the Wilkes' home," he said, handing it to Linda. Another photo showed the same man with a younger boy, their expressions solemn. Linda flipped it over, finding the words 1978, the beginning, scrawled in faded ink. Her mind raced. "What does this mean?" she asked aloud, though no one had an answer. The IDs were equally baffling, each belonging to different people, but all bearing the Jogger's face with slight variations in age and hairstyle. One name stood out among the pile: Elliot Marsh. Paul raised an eyebrow. "Why does that name sound familiar?" Linda rifled through the letters, finding one addressed to Elliot from someone named Daniel. The letter's tone was cryptic and tense, filled with phrases like, "You can't stay hidden forever," and "They'll come for you," just like before. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden crackle from the officer's radio. "We've got movement to the east," the voice said, strained and hurried. "Possible visual on the suspect." The group abandoned the hunting blind, following the officer's lead as they cut through the dense forest. Linda clutched the lockbox tightly, its weight feeling heavier with every step. The trees grew thicker, the moonlight barely penetrating the canopy above. Paul motioned for the group to stop, his eyes narrowing as he pointed to a faint light flickering in the distance. The officers fanned out, their flashlights trained on the ground as they advanced slowly. Linda and Paul stayed close together, their breath visible in the cool night air. The light grew brighter, revealing another makeshift shelter nestled against a rocky outcrop. It was smaller than the blind, but more fortified, with heavy tarps and wooden planks reinforcing its walls. The faint sound of a voice carried through the air, though the words were indecipherable. Linda exchanged a glance with Paul, her grip tightening on the lockbox. Whatever secrets it held, she knew they were closing in on answers that might explain everything. The officer at the front signaled for silence, raising a hand as they approached the shelter. Linda's pulse quickened, her flashlight trembling slightly as she prepared for what lay ahead. The officers signaled for the group to stop just outside the fortified shelter. The faint voice they had heard earlier was clearer now, a low, muttering cadence that sent chills up Linda's spine. She tightened her grip on the lockbox, the weight of its secrets pressing heavily on her. One of the officers crouched low, peering through a gap in the tarp. He turned back to the group and mouthed, "He's inside." Linda's heart raced, her flashlight casting jittery beams on the forest floor as she tried to steady her nerves. The officer motioned for another to circle around and cover the rear of the structure. Paul leaned toward Linda, whispering, "If he's armed, this could go south fast." Linda nodded, her eyes locked on the shelter. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything they had uncovered, the journals, the map, the photos, was converging into something far more sinister than they had anticipated. The lead officer took a deep breath and called out firmly, "Elliot Marsh, this is the police. Come out with your hands up." The muttering inside the shelter ceased instantly. The silence that followed was deafening. Linda held her breath, her pulse pounding in her ears as she waited for any sign of movement. A few agonizing seconds passed before a voice responded from inside. "You shouldn't have come here." The words were calm, almost conversational, but they carried an undercurrent of menace that made Linda shiver. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their flashlights trained on the entrance. "We just want to talk," the lead officer said, his tone measured. "Come out, and we can figure this out together." A tense pause followed, and then the sound of shuffling echoed from within the shelter. Linda's grip on the lockbox tightened as the tarp covering the entrance was pushed aside. The jogger, Elliot Marsh, stepped out slowly, his hands raised. In the moonlight, his gaunt face and hollow eyes looked even more unsettling than before. He was barefoot, his clothes torn and stained with dirt. But it was his expression that struck Linda the most. A mix of resignation and defiance, as though he had been expecting this moment all along. "I told you," he said, his voice eerily calm. "You shouldn't have come." One of the officers moved to restrain him, but before they could act, Elliot dropped his hands and bolted into the woods. Chaos erupted as the officers gave chase, their shouts echoing through the trees. Linda and Paul stood frozen for a moment before Linda made a split-second decision. "We have to follow," she said, already moving after the officers. Paul hesitated but quickly joined her, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. They followed the sound of footsteps and breaking branches, the forest seeming to close in around them. Linda's mind raced as she clutched the lockbox to her chest. Who was Elliot Marsh really? And what was he running from, or toward? The chase led them to a clearing where the ground sloped downward into a rocky ravine. Elliot stood at the edge, silhouetted against the moonlight. His shoulders heaved as he caught his breath, but he made no attempt to climb down. The officers approached cautiously, their flashlights illuminating the scene. "It's over, Elliot," one of them said. "There's nowhere left to run." Elliot turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Linda. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a faint, almost imperceptible smile, he spoke. "You don't understand what you've done." Before anyone could react, he stepped backward, disappearing into the ravine's shadows. Linda's flashlight darted toward the edge, but there was no sign of him, only the sound of rushing water far below. The group stood in stunned silence, the weight of the moment sinking in. Linda's thoughts swirled as she stared into the darkness, clutching the lockbox tighter than ever. The air inside Paul's living room was tense as Linda spread the contents of the lockbox across the coffee table. The photographs, letters, and IDs sat like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. Paul leaned forward, his brow furrowed, while the officers stood nearby, their radios crackling softly. Linda picked up the faded photograph of the Wilkes' house again, her fingers tracing the handwritten date on the back. 1978, she murmured. Why would this house be significant to him, and why now? Paul thumbed through the IDs again. This name, Elliot Marsh, it doesn't seem fake. But look at these other IDs. Different names, Same face, different ages. He's been doing this for decades. One of the officers cleared his throat. We ran the name. Elliot Marsh has no recent records, but an old missing persons case popped up. Filed in 1981, no resolution. Looks like he disappeared around the same time he'd be. What? A young adult? Linda frowned, pulling out one of the letters from the lockbox. He was hiding something long before this. These letters, they're warnings. Someone was looking for him. Someone who wanted him to stay hidden. Paul gestured toward the map they'd taken from the shelter. What about this? These circled houses. The Wilkes house is one of them, but there are at least 3 others. If this is a pattern. Linda's eyes widened. It's not random. He's moving from attic to attic, staying in places that mean something to him. She scanned the map again, her finger landing on a house at the edge of the neighborhood. This one, the Davidson house. It's been vacant for months since the owners moved out. The officer nodded. We've been keeping an eye on that place for squatters, but we haven't checked recently. If he's hiding there, we'll need to act quickly. Linda stood, her determination renewed. Then let's go. If we don't catch him now, he could disappear for good. The group approached the Davidson house under cover of night, flashlights cutting through the stillness. The air was thick with anticipation as the officers surrounded the property, while Linda and Paul waited near the driveway. The house was eerily quiet, its windows dark and uninviting. One of the officers motioned for the group to proceed. They entered through the back door, their movements careful and deliberate. The smell of mildew and stale air hit them immediately, confirming the house's abandonment. Paul nudged Linda, pointing to a set of dusty footprints leading toward the stairs. The officers followed the trail, their flashlights trained on the floorboards. Every creak of the wood seemed to echo, amplifying the tension. Linda's heart raced as they reached the attic ladder. One officer climbed first, his flashlight illuminating the narrow space above. He paused, his voice low. We've got movement. The officer's flashlight illuminated the cramped attic, casting long shadows that danced across the exposed beams and insulation. A figure crouched in the far corner, barely visible but unmistakable. Elliot Marsh. His gaunt face turned toward the light, eyes wide with a mix of defiance and desperation. "Don't move!" the officer barked, climbing further into the space. Linda and Paul waited below, holding their breath as muffled sounds of scuffling echoed from the attic. Elliot didn't make a sound at first, his movements quick and calculated, but the officers were faster. "He's cornered," one officer called down. Moments later, there was a loud thud, followed by a series of shouts. Linda couldn't stand the suspense any longer. "I'm coming up," she called out, hoisting herself onto the ladder despite Paul's protests. When she reached the attic, she found Elliot pinned against the wall by 2 officers. His clothes were torn, his face pale and damp with sweat. Despite his obvious defeat, there was a strange calmness in his expression. "Elliot Marsh," the lead officer said sternly, "you're under arrest for trespassing, breaking and entering, and evading law enforcement." Elliot didn't resist as they cuffed his hands. Instead, he looked directly at Linda, his voice soft but steady. "You don't know what you've done." Linda stepped closer, her flashlight trembling in her grip. "What do you mean? Why were you in the attic? Why the Wilkes' house?" Elliot's lips curled into a faint, cryptic smile. "The answers aren't in their attic, they're in yours." The words sent a chill down Linda's spine. She opened her mouth to demand an explanation, but the officers had already begun escorting him down the ladder. Paul helped her climb back down, his expression a mix of relief and unease. "What did he mean by that?" "I don't know," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. Outside, the flashing lights of the police cars painted the Davidson house in alternating shades of red and blue. Neighbors had gathered on the sidewalks, murmuring amongst themselves as Elliot was led to the waiting vehicle. Linda and Paul watched in silence as he was placed in the back seat. Just before the door closed, Elliot leaned forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "Check the crawl spaces. It's not over." The crowd of neighbors began to disperse as the police cars disappeared down the street, leaving Linda and Paul standing in the cool night air. The weight of Elliot's parting words hung heavy between them. "What did he mean? Check the crawl spaces?" Paul asked, his voice barely concealing his unease. Linda shook her head. "I don't know, but I'm not letting this go. If there's anything we missed, anything connected to what he was doing, we need to find it." Paul sighed, glancing at his watch. "It's almost midnight. If we're going to do this, we should start now." The two of them began their search at Linda's house, combing through the crawl spaces and attic with flashlights and a growing sense of dread. Dust and cobwebs clung to their clothes as they moved storage boxes and peered into dark corners, but they found nothing unusual. Next, they checked Paul's house, then the empty house next door. Each search turned up the same results, nothing out of the ordinary. Exhaustion was beginning to set in when Linda suddenly froze in the middle of the Wilkes living room. "The attic," she said, her eyes wide. "We never searched the crawl space in their attic." Paul stared at her, realization dawning. "You're right. We focused on the space itself, but we never checked the crawl spaces in the walls." Carol Wilkes, who had been quietly watching them, spoke up. "You're welcome to look, but I don't think you'll find anything. We had the attic cleaned out last year." Linda ignored the protest, already climbing the ladder with Paul close behind. The attic felt even more stifling than before, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and insulation. Linda's flashlight swept across the floor until it landed on the far corner where Elliot's hideout had been. She crouched down, knocking gently against the walls. The hollow sound she'd been hoping for answered her almost immediately. "Here," she said, her heart pounding. "There's a space behind this panel." Paul helped her remove the loose wooden board, revealing a narrow compartment between the walls. Inside was a small, tightly wrapped bundle of cloth. Linda's hands trembled as she pulled it out and unwrapped it. The bundle contained a stack of photographs, much older than the ones they'd found before. Each picture showed the same man, a younger Elliot Marsh, standing in front of different houses in the neighborhood, including the Wilkes and Davidson homes. In every photo, Elliot looked over his shoulder as though expecting to see someone behind him. Beneath the photos was a piece of paper with a single phrase scrawled across it. "They are watching." Paul leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "Who's they?" Linda didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the last item in the bundle, a small, weathered key tied to a string. It was labeled simply, "Storage."